often asked the question, when did you realise that Africans in Tudor England were not the epitome of otherness or strangeness? So to answer that question, one needs to sort of think about where this term comes from. This term otherness or the stranger is a modern term. Certainly the other bit is, stranger isn't, but the other is. In early modern or English society, they didn't have an idea or a term for the other. They had a term for the stranger, and we'll come to that, but they didn't have a term for the other. That's a term that we've developed to say that automatically anybody that doesn't fit a certain mold is the other, and that therefore we need ideas of otherness to explain their existence. It's a very convenient way of marginalizing a population to actually say that they were considered automatically the other, without thinking about whether they were or not. So this term of otherness is there to marginalize people of African descent, people of color, not just people of African descent, but also Asian people too, in this country as not part of the mainstream of what we need to research. And also to lump all of those histories together that don't fit the mainstream into the other category. And by fitting into the other category, we kind of, in a way, disparage them. So in about 1998, after at least 10 years of research, I was on a tube station. No, I was at a tube station in 1998 and got on a tube, I think the Victoria line, going from Brixton to Seven Sisters. I think I was at Green Park and I was reading something. I can't remember what it was. I think it was perhaps Simon Valencia, baptized 16th century. And I had a eureka moment because I realized that the person I was reading from his original record, original baptism record, 78 or 88, 1588, wasn't a slave. And it was a simple thing. I suddenly realized that Simon Valencia wasn't a slave. Then I realized that all the other people that I've been researching for the last 10 years were not slaves either. And I realized that if they were slaves, it would have been recorded that they were slaves, because there was no kind of that English political correctness about saying someone was a slave when they weren't. If you were a slave, you would be called a slave. And I realized that all these records that I had been looking at for the last 10 years were describing people that were not slaves. So I said, then where are the slaves? If all these people that I've discovered are not slaves, where are these slaves that people keep talking about? All right, so then I began to think, well, let me try and find out where these slaves are. And I found it very difficult to find these slaves. There'd be one or two people like Pedro. Pedro was someone described as a slave. He was an African that came from the Iberian Peninsula in 1470, 1480s. He got his manumission from Henry VII. And then when he went back to Spain, his manumission was upheld. So this was someone who came in as a slave, nominally, was freed here, and maintained their freedom. So that's not necessarily the traditional arc we may be thinking about. And you'd find one or two others, people such as the African people who came on a ship from Bristol, an indeterminate number, perhaps 20 or 30, who landed here in the 15th, 16th century in Southampton, were here for a short period of time, about a week, and then left again. So this was a mixed group of people, including white Spanish people and Africans. All of that collective group of people were described as slaves. These were the exception. These were the exception. They didn't stay very long. They were here temporarily. They were not constant. They were not a permanent part of the population. So then I thought, okay, if these were the few incidents of people who were enslaved and their status was temporal, peripheral, why do we keep saying that this population was a slave population? All right, okay, so perhaps I thought it was the activities of Englishmen like Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, John Locke, Martin Frobisher, and others who were actively involved in the enslaving of several sets of peoples and operated from Plymouth, Bristol, London, Southampton, Portsmouth, and other cities and towns in this country. But then one discovered that the activities that they did, for the most part, took people from, for example, North America to this country, South America to this country, from the continent of Africa, west coast of Africa, to the Caribbean, from the Iberian Peninsula around the Mediterranean Sea. And their activities didn't mean bringing people of African descent to England. So if they did bring people of African descent to England, what happened to them? Were they able to keep those people as slaves? The answer was no. So they wouldn't bring an African to England, or a Native American person, or another person to this country to keep them as a slave. Because why? Why couldn't they keep them as slaves here? Because the nature of the culture of this society was such that it was difficult to keep anybody as a slave. Okay, then that led on to more thought processes, i.e., what was early modern thought processes? What was the early modern thought about people of African descent? What did white people in England think of the African? Applying the post-colonial mindset would say, obviously, this is 200 years before the development of the British Empire. So the idea would be, since it was 200 years before the idea of the British Empire, and with this idea of modernity, in other words, that things are getting better, the shape of things to come, things are going to get better. Therefore, by default, the past must mean that white English people were more racist 200 years before than they were 200 years later. That's a post-colonial mindset that leads us that way. The idea of modernity, that things are getting better, that we would think that society was more racist in the past than it is now. The second eureka moment occurred 2002, 2003, when I realized that that did not have to be so. Why were things automatically getting better? Why was racism automatically more prevalent in the past than it was as you move forward in history? Could it potentially be that prejudice and discrimination goes up and down, varying according to strength, power of a said group nationality, varying according to the distribution of that nationality in a given geographical location, and that a said group position can alter dramatically, even within a generation. And the discrimination may be present in a society where it was not even present a decade before. I realized that certainly that must be the case, because what I then began to do is apply the notions to a modern African presence in Britain. A modern African presence in Britain talks about, say, for example, from the 1950s till now, just a 60-year period, the amount of ups and downs in our experiences, our status, has gone up and down. It's not been the same. The laws have come in that have changed our status up and down since the 50s till now. I would argue that in some ways, racism now is stronger than it was in the 1990s. It's more overt. And in some ways, it's stronger than it was in the 1980s, but not than it was in the 1950s. So even in that 60-year period, there has been dramatic changes. So to speak in blanket terms about the last 60 years would be a gross overestimation of our situation and condition. It's not just a straight lineal development of racism getting better or racism declining, and that the 50s was worse than now, and that we've slowly been getting better since the 50s. So if that was true for the last 60 years, that almost certainly would be true for 400 years before. So to simply in a blanket way describe that period, 1485 to 1603, as a period in which racism was worse than during the Georgian period, the 18th century, when Britain was an empire, would be a gross miscalculation. It would be wrong. And it would be lazy, what we call lazy scholarship. Lazy scholarship. It's not like that. The situation is that people's position changes, even decade by decade. People's status changes decade by decade. Events and circumstances have an effect on people's status and position. And you can be up 1 minute and you can be down the next. This actually creates a fierce urgency of now, not to just quote Obama, but it's true. It creates a fierce urgency of the now to be ever vigilant about what is happening to your status. Africanus.